In the far north of Senegal, on the edge where the Sahel meets the Sahara, there is a patch of land that was bare, baked, and silent for 40 years. Nothing had grown there in living memory. The soil had hardened like concrete under the sun. When aid workers first arrived and told the village communities that this ground could produce food again, the people shook their heads. They knew this land. They had watched it die. 2 years later, it was growing sorghum and moringa and guava. And the young people who had been leaving every year after the rains, walking away from the village to find harvest work in a country they did not belong to, they were staying. I'm Tom Marsh, and this is the story of the Great Green Wall of Africa, a project so ambitious it was once called impossible, and so simple in its actual methods that the technology it uses is older than anyone who built it. The Great Green Wall is a vision that stretches across the entire width of the African continent, from Senegal on the Atlantic coast to Djibouti on the Horn of Africa. The goal is a living barrier of trees, soil, and restored land, a mosaic of ecosystems wide enough and dense enough to halt the southward march of the Sahara Desert. The Sahara has already expanded by roughly 10% over the last 100 years. That is not a metaphor. That is land that was once usable, grazed, farmed, inhabited, now swallowed by sand and dust. The people who lived on the Sahel's edge did not choose to leave. They were pushed. If you have spent any time reading about land degradation, the collapse of the Sahel, the patterns the scientists found that nobody talks about in the headlines, the full mechanism behind how soil dies, why it refuses to come back without help, and what that means for the 100 million people who depend on it, that material is in the Rewilding Complete Pack, which I put together as a companion resource that goes deeper than any single video can. You will find the link in the description below, or you can scan the QR code on screen right now. Because here is where the story stops being about a single field in northern Senegal and starts being about a question that matters for the rest of the century. Can you actually bring dead land back to life? And if so, how fast? The answer begins with shape, specifically with a crescent. The first time I heard about half-moon earthworks, medias lunas in Spanish, though the technique itself belongs to the Sahel, I thought it sounded almost too obvious. You dig a shallow, crescent-shaped basin in the ground, oriented along the natural contour of the slope, with a low raised berm on the downhill side. When rain falls, the water flows into the crescent and stays there, instead of running off across the baked surface and disappearing. The soil beneath absorbs it slowly. Root systems can reach it. Seeds can germinate into it. What sounds simple becomes extraordinary at scale. On one rehabilitated plot in northern Senegal, the World Food Programme's project team has installed 7,500 of these half-moons across 30 hectares. Each one is 4 meters across. Each one takes one person roughly 1 day to dig. A team of 150 people worked this land not with machines, not with imported infrastructure, but with tools and bodies, and a technique that was developed right here in the Sahel, used for centuries, then forgotten as conventional farming, replaced traditional knowledge, and then quietly recovered. That recovery matters. The team was not importing a solution, they were excavating one from the past. And none of this was guaranteed. When the World Food Programme first sat down with village communities and described what they intended to do with the most exhausted, most compacted, most visually hopeless stretch of land in the area, the response was not hope, it was refusal. 40 years, people said. Nothing has grown here for 40 years. You are telling us this will produce food? The community had watched the soil die in real time. They had drawn their own conclusions. The process that followed was not top-down. It started with what the project called participatory community planning, a structured conversation in which the people who actually lived on this land, who knew where the water moved in the rainy season and where it vanished, who understood which plants had once grown in which corners of the landscape, contributed that knowledge directly to the restoration design. By the end of that process, there was agreement, there was investment. And there was something more fragile and more important than either belief. Now look at what the soil was doing once the half moons began to hold water. Around 10 to 15% of the retained rainfall, according to figures from the project's own field records, was percolating below the crescent basins and recharging the groundwater table beneath. This is not incidental. Groundwater in the Sahel is the difference between a dry season economy and a year-round one. When you return water to the soil rather than letting it skim the surface and evaporate, you do not just grow plants. You rebuild the aquifer. You shift the entire water cycle of the landscape, one crescent at a time. What the team planted into those crescents was not chosen at random. Sorghum and millet, the staple crops of the Sahel, were the anchor species, and for a reason that goes deeper than tradition. These grains were domesticated in this region thousands of years ago. They evolved here. They produce exceptional biomass on minimal water, which means they are not only feeding the community, but actively building organic matter in the soil each season, breaking down, composting, softening the compaction that had made the land look like concrete. The food crop was also the soil medicine. Between the crescent basins, the team laid biomass trenches, shallow ditches planted with moringa, pigeon pea, and okra. Moringa grows rapidly, fixes nitrogen into the soil, and provides nutrition. Pigeon pea does the same. Okra produces marketable food within weeks. And between those trenches, in planting pits spaced at regular intervals, the team placed fruit trees, guava, citrus species that will take years to mature, but that will eventually turn this restored land into something that resembles and behaves like a productive forest edge. That pattern has a name in one of its formalized versions: syntropic agriculture. The practice was developed in Brazil, but draws on indigenous land management traditions from across the world, including West Africa. The underlying logic is the same everywhere it appears. Stop treating bare land as a blank canvas to be planted in rows, and start treating it as a forest in an early stage of succession, needing only guidance and time to move toward abundance. What the WFP team built in northern Senegal is not a farm in the conventional sense. In its mature state, 10, 15 years from now, it will look like a forest, with staggered layers of canopy and understory, producing biomass and fruit and shade and root structure, with market garden beds running between the tree lines. This is exactly the logic of the Great Green Wall at its most honest. The wall is not a wall. It was never going to be a continuous line of planted trees stretching 8,000 kilometers from coast to coast. What it actually means, on the ground, is a mosaic, a patchwork of restored plots, rehabilitated pasture, managed woodland, and community-held agroforestry. The patches fit together across national borders and biomes and rainfall gradients, until collectively they form something that functions the way a barrier functions, slowing the desert, giving the soil beneath the encroaching sand a reason to hold together. The WFP has rehabilitated approximately 300,000 hectares of degraded land in the Sahel in recent years. The 30 hectares of that northern Senegal project are part of it, a single pixel in a vast image that is still being assembled. And then there is the river. The Senegal River runs along the northern border of the country, separating it from Mauritania. From space, the transition is visible without explanation. On the Mauritanian side, the dunes come right down to the water's edge. On the Senegalese side, there is green, or the ghost of green, or the memory of it. The river is not just a national border. It is the boundary between the Sahara and the Sahel, between desert and degraded grassland along much of its length. And because of that, its riparian zone, the strip of land along each bank capable of holding moisture and supporting vegetation, represents the front line. The first defense, the place where, if vegetation can be established and held, the desert's advance stalls. The Great Green Wall's most strategically important work may be happening there, in a strip of land that looks, to anyone passing through, like a problem too large to solve with a shovel. But the shovels have already started. Here is what I want you to hold. The villagers who told the WFP team that this land was dead, they were not wrong. They were describing what they had seen. For decades, the young people of the Sahel's northern communities had been making a particular journey at the end of each rainy season. When the rain stopped and the harvest was done, they walked south, to Dakar, to larger towns. Some went further across the Mediterranean, to Spain to harvest apples and olives and almonds, doing the agricultural work their home ground could no longer sustain, and sending money back to villages that were slowly emptying of everyone except the old. That migration is not just a human statistic. It is the measurement of a landscape's failure. When the land cannot feed the people who grew up on it, the people leave. When the people leave, the knowledge of how to tend that land walks out with them. The degradation accelerates. The desert moves south. What stopped that chain of departure, at least on this one project, was not a government program in the abstract. It was a well, a physical well, dug as part of the restoration project, providing water access through the dry season. With 12 months of viable cultivation instead of 4, the calculation changed. Young men who had been mentally preparing for the road to Dakar said, in plain terms, that they were no longer thinking about leaving. The village had something to offer them. The land had something to offer them. There's an old word in the Wolof language of Senegal teranga that means hospitality, a generosity of place and welcome. It is a word that survived the land's long degradation, used in contexts that had nothing to do with soil or trees or water. It will mean something different again when the land it describes is growing. We did not restore this landscape with a new technology. We reached back into the knowledge the landscape itself had generated: half-moon earthworks, indigenous polyculture, native species, community planning, and we applied it with patience and labor in exactly the place where the desert was winning. The land responded. The water stayed. The trees are coming. There are more stories like this one than you'd imagine. The patterns behind them, why some degraded ecosystems come back and others don't, what the science says about the tipping points and the warning signs, and what happened in the cases that looked like failure before they became something else. All of that is in the Rewilding Complete Pack. The link is in the description below, and the QR code was on screen a few minutes ago if you missed it. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that the desert is not winning everywhere. Leave me a comment. Do you think the Great Green Wall will be completed in our lifetime? I want to know what you think. We did not restore the landscape. We returned the knowledge that knew how, and we stepped back. I'm Tom Marsh. Thank you for watching.